Great to see each one this morning. We come each week to try and worship God in spirit and in truth, and it's in this time to the church we strive to proclaim His Word as the example has told us to do. When you read Genesis and the creation event from chapter 1 through chapter 3, I think that's important to include all of that. What you end up having is a beautiful picture that God takes that and creates the cosmos. He creates the order. And what's great about it is that if you follow order, it works. And I know in the 6 days of creation, the seventh day God rested, you don't read about necessarily gravity. But every aspect of what He creates was creating laws that would govern us that you have to have. Could you imagine this morning us trying to fulfill the command of 1 Corinthians 14, do everything decently and in order, if all of a sudden we didn't have the law of gravity? That would be quite a sight to see us trying to sink. But He created the ways in which we are able to see, and that helps us to be able to perceive and even read His Word. He created for us a concept that we are able to hear. And we were talking about that this week in class on one of the chapel sessions. We were talking about song leading a little bit. And there are certain voices that are hard to hear. Brother Max Kelly read for us a moment ago. I appreciate that, Brother Max. But Brother Max is one of the harder voices for us in this auditorium to be able to hear. No fault of his own. It's the way our ears work. It's very intriguing, in fact, to a sound man that you have to start adjusting tones and stuff to make it, because our ears naturally will pick up a higher frequency unless we've damaged that frequency. And we learned this in music years ago. I remember them lining up several tubas. That's the big, large, low brass instrument on the end of a football field. And there were multiple of them, and they lined up one flute, and we all stood at the other end of the field. And what we found out is they all played their loudest, all those large tubas with the big bell to project the horn. And here's this flute with this little bitty outlet on the end, even pointing not directly at us. We could actually hear the flute just as well as we could hear the tubas. And it had to do with the frequency ranges. See, God put that in order as well. That's kind of neat, isn't it? He put all the things that we're figuring out today. And I ran out and left my smartphone, so I won't pull it out. But everything that makes those cell phones that you have work, the things in nature that He has placed in order, that we are just now learning how to harness, He put that in order for us. And see, God also knew when He created man and He placed him in the Garden of Eden, He says, it's not good that man should be alone. And it's really interesting that part of this process recorded for us in these beginning chapters of the book of beginnings, that book of Genesis, is that He causes the animals to come before Adam, and Adam gives them names. And wouldn't that be a task to have to do? But He starts naming them, and that being recorded for us was for one purpose. Well, maybe two. One, the dominion that He is to have over creation. But two, is that there was not one of those animals that was found to be the companion for man. And yes, I understand dogs are man's best friend, we say, and they are kind of neat little companions that I find myself, that dog jumping up on the chair, I'll scoot over and make room for him. Because he's a nice little buddy to have sometimes. In fact, it's been proven, if you want to lower somebody's heart rate, oftentimes petting a dog or a cat can calm a person down. So there was purpose in the creation, but not a single animal was suitable to be the help mate, or the word there, suitable for man. And so that's when God causes a deep sleep to come upon Adam. He takes a rib from Adam's side and he forms Eve. And we have this great event that Brother Max was reading for us, and he says, and for this cause shall man leave father and mother and cleave unto each other. And what he describes there is a marriage union. Because God knew everything with his infinite knowledge when he created this world of exactly what we need. And he knew it starts. The importance of the beginnings of a home. And while God could have chosen all these different ways for man to procreate the earth, and you know, I know children's stories, we talk about that the baby comes with a stork. And you know the image I'm talking about, it pops into your head, him carrying this linen cloth, and that's how the baby's delivered. No, it's with one man, it's with one woman coming together in the marriage bed. And that's why the book of Hebrews, I don't remember the exact chapter off the top of my head. I started to go chapter 5 and I was off just a little bit. But the marriage bed is undefiled. Because when a man and a woman come together and they procreate another life into this world, see, God knew what needed to happen. And what needed to happen was for a child to have both father and mother. And that's why the act of procreation happens with a man and with a woman. But you know what man does with anything? He messes it up. He creates chaos. Where God brings cosmos, he brings order. He brings chaos to it. And he starts teaching things like that marriage isn't important. And that's what we're being told so much of the time, that marriage, it doesn't really matter. And we have people, and I would say young people, but y'all, it's not just young people, it's older people too, that decide marriage not important. We're just going to shack up together. I know they don't call it shacking up anymore because that was connected to a derogatory term, and so we're not supposed to use that today. So we are going to cohabitate together. And we'll just live together, and we'll do so unmarried, but pretend like everything's okay. But God calls that fornication, which is a sin. Romans chapter 1. And I know what people say. They say, oh, but we're not doing anything together. We're not. But what it does is it makes a mockery of what God has created. For this cause. What is the cause? A man and a woman shouldn't be alone, and they come together in the bond of marriage as God designed it. That's when men and women live together. And we live together for other reasons than we have just spit in the face of God. And we said, oh, I know what you created, but see, we know something better. We've come up with a better way. And I know you said it's for marriage and that you're to be fruitful, multiply, and do all that. But you know what? That's okay. We're just going to go cohabitate because this is better, because we have evolved into higher ways of thinking. And it's an insult. It's an insult to God. Because God knew what he was doing. God knew exactly what we needed. He understood we need husbands and wives. It's important that wives submit to their husbands, that husbands love their wives even as their own body. This is all coming from Ephesians chapter 5. And that we have a marriage relationship so that a child can be taught from a young age how to grow up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. That the child can learn love. But you read even in the Old Testament, man, they made a mockery of this. And very early we can see in the days of Abraham that Abraham decides that he'll take Hagar, the handmaid, at the suggestion of the wife. And I think about, where was Abraham to say, no, Sarai. No, Sarah, we will trust in God, and we're going to follow God's way. And when God says that we're going to have a child, let's not try and help God. Let's trust in God. Let's have faith in God. But no, there was Abram and says, okay. And takes Hagar and conceives a child with her, and you have Ishmael. And God expresses His displeasure and explains that, no, this is not what I said. This is not what I was putting in order. This was what you decided you would do. I said, I'll give you a child. You and Sarah, I'll give you a child. And so He does. And that child's name is Isaac. And it's through him we have the descendants of Israel. And some people wonder today, why do we have so much confusion between those of the religion of Islam and those of especially the Jews and Christianity? Then I can trace that back all the way to where man decided to break what God designed in marriage because it seemed good to him. It seems to make sense. What's it going to hurt? Sarah said it was okay. And what happened? Anybody in this room knows what's going to happen if one man takes more than one wife. Jealousy. Jealousy takes place. And so they decide that they're going to have this bitterness, and finally Abraham, he sends out Hagar and Ishmael. Gives them a little food, a little water, says, go, you can't be here because why? Sarah is jealous because with Isaac and she doesn't want me spending time with you. Sends them away, in essence, to die. Now we understand God took care of them. And it was promised, and he should have received, whenever the time that Jesus came, it should have brought them all together, but because of their rejection, both Jews' rejection and both because of Ishmael's descendants' rejection, they never came together, and we still have conflict to this day. And we think, well, things will be better with Jacob. Because surely Jacob would have learned from his grandfather's mistake of having more than one woman in that kind of relationship. But no, the animosity that existed between the sons of Jacob existed because Jacob had more than one wife. See, all the way back in the Garden of Eden, God gave us the design for marriage, and that's one man, one woman, and for life. And I could go through the Old Testament, and I could talk about how the smartest man or the wisest man in this world, other than Jesus Christ, talking about Solomon and how he was the smartest, wisest man, that whenever God told him, you ask for anything, I'm going to give it to you, he said, I asked for wisdom on how to rule the people. And God gave it to him, and he gave him great riches and all this. But just because God gave him the wisdom doesn't mean he listened to it, because what he started doing was taking wives of foreign countries, and he had a multiplicity of wives. After Solomon, you start reading about the problem of idolatry that would plague the people over and over and over again. And you see about this idea of them going and worshiping the idolatry in the high places. Do you want to know who built those places in the high places? Solomon. Solomon, the one that was supposed to be so wise, he built in the nation of Israel places of idolatry. Places for people to worship idols. And you know why he did it? To appease his wives, to give those foreign wives places to worship. David, man after God's own heart, with the sin of adultery. 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 12. Not respecting the marriage bed, to bring devastation that even in the case of his own children would have problems to deal with them because old dad could not set the right example. We go forward to Hosea. Hosea is the one that's really kind of interesting. I know I use Hosea 4 and verse 6 a lot, but Hosea was the one that was told to go take a wife of harlotry. And I don't quite understand the book of Hosea all the time. I know the spiritual meaning of it, though, because his wife leaves him and becomes a harlot again, and God instructs him to go and buy back his wife. Can you imagine? But the lesson there, by the way, is that God over and over and over and over compares the situation that when we, as children of God, go and serve the world or Satan or idolatry, he compares us to that as adulterers and adulteresses. Now, I say all that because we fast forward to today and we see divorce being so rampant. I don't have a statistic I'm going to flash upon the screen. All you got to do is go to your work, go to your neighbors and start talking. And very quickly, it will not take you long to find out that many of your friends that you know are divorced and being remarried. And the divorce is not seen as a big thing at all anymore. Where in our country at one point in time, and certainly our country's never been perfect, but at one point in time, divorce was looked down upon. Because we understood it for what it is. It's when one has not fulfilled a commitment in which they had made, not only to each other, but to God. And when you start trying to survey how much is being taught and preached upon today about marriage and divorce and remarriage, and it's not a subject that we talk about much anymore. Because you get among preachers, you start talking to them, and you find out that whenever you're going out there teaching and you're coming across somebody, chances are there's a very high probability they're in a situation of marriage and divorce and remarriage that is not right in the sight of God. And you understand that they have got to stop living in the adultery, and you got to convince them of that in order to bring them to Christ. And that is a great challenge in many situations, but brethren, it's a challenge we've got to face. But what's happening in the Lord's church is we become more tolerant of divorce and remarriage for unscriptural reasons today, and we're just turning a blind eye to it. And brethren, we can't. So let's take our Bibles and go to Matthew chapter 19. We're going to notice several passages today. We're going to notice 1 Peter 3. We're going to notice 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Matthew chapter 19, as well as Matthew chapter 5, and I'll leave the lesson with you. In Matthew chapter 19, they come. We'll just start reading in verse 1. It came to pass that when Jesus had finished these sayings, he departed from Galilee and came into the coast of Judea beyond Jordan. And great multitudes followed him, and he healed them there. Verse 3, the Pharisees also came unto him, tempting him and saying unto him, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? What he's asking there is saying, is it all right to put her away? Well, verse 4, he answered and said unto them, have you not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female? Let me pause there, because the mockery, I've left out a part of my introduction I want to go to. The mockery that we make of marriage today is when we say a man and a man can be married. United States government might give them the right to be married, but brethren, they are not married in God's sight. United States government might say a woman and a woman can be married, but they are not married in God's sight. Because he tells us very clearly a male and female. The way he made them, he takes it back to the very beginning. And that's a mockery. We make a mockery today with this concept of the idea of open marriages, that somehow a man and a woman could be married, but that it's okay for them to, and I'll use the word fornication, with anybody they want to, as long as each other are in agreement with it. No. That's not what God says. This idea of swinging, and I won't go into that if you don't understand what that is. See me later, men, women, ask my wife. And Not that we have experience, but that we know the definition of what it means. And it's not cute, it's not acceptable in the sight of God, but it's sinful behavior that's destroying the home. Anyway, verse 4. Made them male and female. Verse 5. And said, for this cause shall a man leave father and mother, shall cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Wherefore they are no more twain, that's two, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. And this is where we get from the verses of Scripture that when marriage takes place, that it's a beautiful ceremony as far as the sense that it's a man, it's a woman, it's in their agreement, they are coming together, but it's not the laws of this land. I'm not saying that the laws of this land aren't important. Certainly Romans 13 tells us to respect the laws of this land as well as what Peter would write. And so yes, we need to go ahead and follow whatever the laws of the land says, but y'all, it's God that joins a man and a woman together. There are three in that marriage. Not a man and two women, not a woman and two men. There's a man, a woman, and God. And God is the glue that should hold that marriage together while on this earth. And so when it talks about this twain and one flesh, I can go at length about this because y'all, we have a society that has taught us in the United States of independence, and we're so busy trying to keep our independence that so oftentimes we can never have our marriage be the great blessing that God intended it to be because we're more concerned about keeping our own identity. That's a whole sermon in and of itself because our identity ought to be being found in who God wants us to be and not who we want to be. But you got two people. They're coming together, one flesh. God put them together. So they say unto him, why did Moses then command to give a writing of divorcement and put her away? And we go back to Deuteronomy 24 and verse 1 and notice that, but we're going to keep reading here. And he says, he saith unto them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, suffered you to put away your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. God allowed Moses to do that. Moses conducted that, but he's saying that was never the intent of what God wanted. That's why he took them back to the very beginning of time. One man, one woman. God joins them together, and that's where they should be for life. Verse 9, and I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, and that's the idea of divorcement. Whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication. The word fornication just simply means illicit sexual activity. Now, parents, if you have a child in here and you say, oh, he used that word, illicit sexual activity, get over it. Your child is seeing more than that when they turn on the television. They're hearing more than that when you send them to school. And you need to be talking to them from a young age about the birds and the bees. And you need to be talking about what's appropriate and inappropriate. And where people should touch them and when they should not touch them. Because we live in a world that has been given over to perversion. And they are surrounding yourselves. You can't walk down the mall without seeing pornographic material hanging in the windows. And you can sit there naive and think, my children don't know anything about this. But I promise you they do. Fornication, except it be for fornication, illicit sexual activity. Now let me define that. That's any sexual activity that takes place outside of the marriage bed. That includes before marriage, cohabitation. It includes that if you are married, anybody other than your wife or your husband, depending on if you're a male or a female this morning. And let me qualify that. That doesn't change any part of your life. He says, so unless it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth what? Adultery. And whoso marrieth her which is put away, doth commit adultery. Now y'all, God doesn't make it any clearer than that. Oh, I know what people say. But preacher, let's say in this situation and this, let's just take this situation. Because he spells it out for them in a way which they came tempting and trying and saying there's only one reason. And that is if a spouse has been put away because they fornicated. That's the only reason. And if that spouse fornicated, if they marry again, talking about the guilty spouse, then they are living in adultery. And by the way, you might not have ever been married, but if you marry that person that has been put away because they committed adultery, then now you are living in adultery. And that is displeasing to God. And I know that seems harsh. I know it seems tough. But Malachi 2 verse 16 tells us that God hates divorce. And for me to allow people to come again and to be able to worship God on Sunday mornings, as I know there are congregations that bear the name Church of Christ in this area that are allowing this, and they come in and they sit down and they're singing praises to God. Oh, how I love Jesus. And they are divorced and remarried sitting on this side. And then the person they divorced and then they themselves have got remarried are sitting on this side. Y'all, it cannot be happening and be pleasing to God. Because the only reason for that is for fornication. Matthew chapter 5, verse 32. We'll start reading in verse 31, Randy. It hath been said, talking about the law of Moses, whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. But I say unto you that whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, causeth her to commit adultery. And whosoever shall marry her that is divorced, committeth adultery. This morning you may sit here and you may have had a qualified reason to be divorced and remarry, and that would mean that your spouse cheated on you and you were faithful to your spouse. But if you marry one that was guilty of fornication, then your marriage is in adultery. And you cannot continue in that and be pleasing to God. If both of you, I could sit here for almost 20 minutes trying to give you every example here. Because if you're guilty of fornication, that's illicit sexual activity. And if in the bonds of marriage you are guilty of committing that fornication, and while you were married and you were put away, you cannot remarry. And some people say, well, that's harsh. That's tough. And maybe it is. Maybe it is a difficult thing to understand. I believe, in fact, Jesus understood it was a difficult understanding, because look at Matthew chapter 19 and verse 10. His disciples say unto him, if the case of the woman be so with his wife, it is not good to marry. See, they understood. But he said unto them, all men cannot receive this saying, save they to whom it is given. For there are some eunuchs which were so born from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs of men. The Ethiopian eunuch would be one of those, by the way. And there be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. It means the one that cares more about being able to go to the heaven, the one that wants to have the kingdom of God, understood that because of past decisions he or the significant other that he is in the adulterous relationship has made, if they care more about that, then so be it. They're going to continue in that. But the one that cares more about the kingdom of God, the one that seeks first God's kingdom, Matthew 6:33, he's not going to cause himself, nor that one that supposedly he loves, to go to hell over this. Now, before I go to 1 Corinthians 7, let me tell you something. I know of a case in which a man loved a woman. They got married. I'm not going to call their names. He told me I could use this as an example, but you don't need to know the name. But I met him one time when we were doing a school campaign, and all of us students were living, and well, not living, but staying in the church building while we were conducting the campaign. That was quite interesting to put all of us up in there. So we stayed in the classrooms, and during that gospel meeting, the campaign we were conducting there, the preachers that lived next door, his sister came for a visit, along with one of her friends, and along with another friend that was a man. Now, I say that I have to always be careful how I say this, because he won't even refer to himself as her ex-husband. Because the only way he could refer to himself as ex-husband is to look to the laws of the land that gave them a written marriage license. But they were studying. And they studied God's Word, and this preacher had studied with them at length and showed them that because of the situation that they had, because the one being guilty of fornication and having been put away, they had no right to be married in the sight of God. Only in the laws of this land were they married. And so what he did is they did away with the laws of this land. They no longer lived together. And they realized that they could not put forth the impression to people that they were married, because that would be the same as Abraham trying to tell people that that was his sister. And that's a half-truth. So they paid the price, and it hurt their taxes, and it made them have to change their income, and they did that. And I'm going to tell you, you want to know who stayed in that church building with us that night? He did. Because he said, I won't even sleep. Even though it's in the house with some other people, I'm not even going to let people think that we're living as married. You want to know why the sister had a female friend that came along? Because it was a very lengthy drive, and they didn't want it to be said that they were stopping along the way for a hotel. First time I ever encountered somebody like this. Oh, I've encountered people all the time that are in adulterous marriages that are not marriages in the sight of God, and they refuse to leave. I've encountered that, but this was the first time I saw somebody that could say they love God with all their heart, with all their soul, with all their mind. I said, well, if you really love her, how could you do that? He said, well, if I love her, how can I let her soul go to hell just for selfish reasons? So that I can lie with her, so that I could pretend to be married. And yes, they were friends, but they were no longer husband and wife in any shape, face, or form, because they loved God first. And then, yes, they truly loved each other, that they didn't want their souls to be lost. That's amazing, isn't it? My father preached a sermon similar to this. I don't know exactly what format and how, but he was preaching on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And there was a couple there that had not realized, because that had not been preached. When it had been preached, the preacher was a little soft on it, because he didn't want to upset people. Daddy had no idea. There was actually some good friends of theirs in that congregation. He called Daddy up and said, Daddy, we got to talk. Oh, not Daddy. Larry, we got to talk. And he and my dad, they went and had a conversation. And he said, we have no rights in God's sight to be married. And so you know what they did? Is they immediately drew up the legal documents. They started separating things. They worked it out. The man ended up building a little shed that he lives in while the woman lives in another place. They got family together. Yes, I understand it's not always pretty, because we create chaos out of order when we leave God's way. But I'll tell you what, they cared more about God. They loved each other enough to want to see them go to heaven than to live a lie here in this world. Let's notice 1 Corinthians chapter 7 very quickly, though, and I'll leave the lesson with you. I think there's several things that we could talk about. Paul had written by permission, talking about in the times here of ministry that perhaps it would be better for some men not to marry, understanding the great persecution and the hindrance that it could cause. And it wasn't a forbiddance, but he says, verse 1, now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Now, that's important, y'all. Because I'm not saying, and I want to qualify this, I'm not saying every young person that's unmarried is committing fornication. But I will say this, that we have many young people not approaching the bonds of marriage because they're getting the fruits of marriage outside of the bonds of marriage. I hope you're old enough to figure out what I'm saying there. That they don't have to get married in order to enjoy the benefits. And that's called fornication, y'all. So he says, if to avoid fornication, you need to get married. And I want to tell adults, your young people come to you and they want to get married, and they're not done with college yet. I just want you to ask yourself a question. Would you rather them wait till college is over with and fornicate, or would you rather them go ahead and face the challenges of being married while completing college? And those are some things we need to think about sometimes. Because I know in the business world, in the secular world, we say, oh, well, no, let them wait. Let them get on their footing. Let them get paid for a house. Let them do those things. But I will quote from 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 2. Rather than burn in lust one to another, it's better to what? To marry. Let the husband, verse 3, render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. The wife hath not power over her own body, but the husband. Likewise also the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife. Defraud ye not one another, except to be content for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you, not for incontinency. I can't get the word out. Incontinency. When we think about this, incontinency. There we go. I know I'm getting the O right and couldn't get it out. When we think about this concept and idea of due benevolence, it needs to be taught more. And in this setting, I'm not going to go at length about this. But you have to understand what he's writing about here if you're going to understand verse 15 here in a little bit. This is where this is supposed to take place, because this is the marriage bed, and this is how you avoid fornication. Verse 7, I would all men that even as I myself, but every man hath his proper gift of God, one that after this manner, and another after that. I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them to marry if they abide, even as I. Now this would go back to Jesus' teaching when he said that some are eunuchs by willingness. He said, but if you cannot willingly make yourself a eunuch, not physically there, but by choice up here, then you need to marry. And verse 8, I say therefore to the married and widows, it's good for them if they abide even as I, but if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it's better for them to marry than to burn. Now for those people that think fornication is no big deal, what's he say? This is kind of going on over there, Revelation 21 verse 8, is it not? All them that commit these sins will have their part in where? The lake of fire. Verse 10, and unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. And if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband, and not let the husband put away his wife. Why? Because the only reason for divorce and remarriage, according to Matthew 19:9-532, is fornication. And so if your wife leaves you, don't put her away. If you leave your husband, and some people say, well, what could this be about? Maybe it's about a physical abusive relationship that she must have to leave. Oh, I've seen some situations, y'all, that he had to leave over the same thing. I won't make the joke anyway. See me later, I'll make the joke. But it's happened that they had to leave because of the abusive relationship. And it may be that one leaves, but what is the hope? This is a commitment. God's joined you together. The only reason for you to separate as far as a written bill of divorcement according to what God is saying is because of the case of fornication. So they're to leave, but it's with the hopes of getting back together. Now you go put her away and all of a sudden you get remarried, what have you done? Now, you've committed fornication because you don't have a legal reason for divorce in the sight of God, and now you've taken that opportunity away. But to the rest, verse 12, I speak not, the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any brother hath a wife, believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let her not put away the woman which hath a husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. And they say, oh, he's not under bondage of sin. There's a reason we started in verse 1. Because in verse 1 and following, it talks about that you don't have a right to defraud one another. And I know what the world says about this. Again, I'll be careful here because we're a mixed company. But wives, you don't defraud your husband in that marriage bed. And husbands, you don't defraud your wife. You have a responsibility to them. But if one leaves, this is what the verse is talking about. If he's off living with another woman, if he's off committing these sins, then don't you fret that you're not fulfilling the responsibilities. You are not bound to that any longer. He didn't say the whole marriage, because what is the hope back here is that you can be reconciled one day to get to each other, and then you can go back to the obligations. One final passage. We'll notice 1 Peter chapter 3. We've noticed from the gospel accounts, we've noticed from a Pauline epistle. Now I want to go to one other. Because sometimes people want to say, but if it's non-Christians and they didn't know better before. Let me tell you something. I've heard that said. And most of the time when we make stupid arguments, and I'm going to call that a stupid argument. If that offends you, Matthew 18 says you have a responsibility to come to me, and I'll be here and you come to me, okay? But that's a stupid argument. You just didn't think that one out. Because if you're not amenable to the law of Christ because of ignorance, that means you're not held accountable because you don't know, then why did God tell us to take the Great Commission to the whole world? If they're going to be saved because they didn't know Jesus, let's not do them an injustice and go teach them Jesus and make them accountable. If they're not going to be held accountable to the Bible, let's just not talk to people about the Bible, because they'll stand a better chance going to heaven, right? But the Great Commission is given that we go into all nations, go to the whole world and teaching them, because He is going to command the whole world, because by what is He will judge everybody? The law of Jesus Christ, the gospel. And that's the seriousness of evangelism, is yes, we have a lot of people out there that are digging holes for themselves and they have no idea what they're doing. And what do we need to be doing? We need to be teaching them. But to sit there and say, well, you know, all this about marriage, divorce, remarriage, it doesn't apply to a non-Christian. Well, the only way you can argue that is to say that the law does not apply to non-Christians. And if the law doesn't apply to non-Christians, let's just not tell them about it so they can go to heaven without it. But that's not what God said to do. 1 Peter chapter 3, though. What's it say here? Likewise, you wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they also may without the word be won by the conversation of the wise. While they behold your chaste conversation, coupled with fear, whose adorning let it not be that outward adorning of plaiting the hair and of wearing of gold. All right, that's enough. I could keep going here, but that gives me what we need. Here is a wife that may have a husband that is unbelieving, a non-Christian. Does the bonds and laws of marriage about God joining people still apply? He says it does. So, y'all, Satan knows what he's doing. Old saying, I've read it many times in many of the older books that I've written. And I've read that have been written. So goes the church, so goes the home. So goes the home, so goes the church. Satan knows what he's doing when he attacks the home. Because attacks upon the home is the whole reason we don't have qualified elders and deacons in so many congregations of the Lord's church today. Because they've disqualified themselves early in age. And the time to be preaching this isn't after people have gotten themselves into the situation. The time to be preaching it is to be talking and teaching our young people about this every single day. You need to be thinking about who you're marrying. Why are you interested in her? Why are you interested in him? We need to be teaching. Marriage is for life. We got to get it out of their heads that divorce is even an option. Because y'all, marriage is tough. Marriage is hard. Except for me, because I got the perfect wife. See how that works, right? Take advantage when you can. Now, it's tough for us because she's married to an imperfect husband, right? Marriage is tough. Marriage is hard. And if you think there's an escape chute that you can pull the handle and get out of it, then people are going to do it. But if you've got it in your mindset to be pleasing to God, I am married to my wife, to my husband for life, then we're going to stop looking for this out. And if you find yourself in the relationship that is an adulterous relationship because you got yourself into it, let me ask you, do you love yourself more than you love that significant other? I won't call it a spouse because God has not joined you. Do you love God more than do you love yourself more than her or him? Do you love yourself more than you love God? There is a reason that every single time that God talks about the children of Israel going off a whoring after idolatry, He calls them an adulterous generation because, y'all, adultery is not viewed in a positive light upon God. And we need to stop creating environments in our worship assemblies, in our gatherings, that make people feel comfortable when they're in those situations. Now let me throw one caveat. If you're the innocent party, my heart goes out to you. Because God has spoken of the horrific things that you have already gone through. And that is the reason for the clause, so to speak, in Matthew 19. And if you have found yourself a faithful Christian spouse, you know the blessing. But the ones that have fallen guilty of all of this in the past, you know they're the ones that will tell you, Guyton, preach it. You need to let people know they don't need to go through everything that we've gone through. So I'm going to extend a couple invitations. One, the first invitation isn't one to walk forward on necessarily, but if you have questions about the marriage relationship you're in, on whether it's scriptural or not, if I've said something that has opened your eyes, that has made you, maybe I made you mad, I don't know, come sit down with the eldership and me, and we will talk, and we will look to God's Word, and we will help find answers on how you can be pleasing in the sight of God. That's the first invitation. The second is, if you know you're in it and you're ready to make change right now, then let's at least pray for forgiveness, and then we'll sit down and talk of how you can take it. Perhaps it's another sin that you know that you have in life this morning. The invitation is extended to you as well, if you're a child of God, to come back making your life right with Him. If you're not a child of God, then we're going to encourage you to become a child of God this morning. And I know this sermon hasn't been designed to teach you that, but y'all, it's the best relationship you can ever be in. Because it is when you are a part of Jesus Christ. See, the bride of Jesus. That's what the church is described as. We are the bride of Christ. And you can become a part of that this morning in faith, repenting of your sins, confessing Christ, and being baptized. As together, we stand and sing.